Everyday Samurai, Episode 67. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. How do you do? Thank you for joining us once again, and I trust you are doing well. If you've ever spent any time in a traditional Japanese martial arts dojo, you might have noticed that there's a preference for live foliage, fauna, and produce on the spirit shelf, or kamidana. These offerings from nature and the bounty of the harvest are meant for the divine energies said to inhabit the hall. Bringing fresh flowers, plants, or produce like apples, squash, or rice shows these divine entities that you are productive and in harmony with nature. This practice indicates an appreciation for life and recognition of a larger field of intelligence and activity that humans participate in and perform before. Offering productivity and nature's bounty to spiritual entities on the kamidana acknowledges one's own mortality, recognizing that there are cycles to the experience of life, growth, maturity, and eventual death. These offerings need regular updates, including daily water to replace that which has turned stagnant and dusting away any accumulated detritus. Attending to the dojo grounds involves a continual process of pruning, weeding, and cutting back foliage. In January of 2025, I reflected on the late December susuharai, or the big cleaning of the dojo. This thorough cleansing of the space in which you train is akin to a spring cleaning, but closes out the year by accessing hard-to-reach places in order to remove dust, grit, pollen, and other materials that have accumulated there. Starting the year in pristine conditions reflects the nature of practice in the dojo, continual renewal of the self as well as the space. Art tends to imitate life in this way. The martial art implies an imitation of reality. Art only imitates life, but is never life itself. In Japanese martial arts, working with potentially deadly force techniques, tools, and weapons means that dojo conditions can never equate that of combat. The dojo is a place of the way, a philosophy of being, and a means for exercising the mind, body, and spirit to better approach conflict and everyday challenges with composure. Japanese martial art is not a combatives program in the general sense. Art only imitates life, and the map is never the territory. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Art inculcates skills and attitudes through repetitive practice, with necessary restrictions on training approaches to avoid ever equating the combat conditions, because there is a high potential for death, disfigurement, or great bodily harm. Interpersonal combat is more uncertain and violent than anything in a dojo. A recent social media post reminded me that the map is never the territory, and art can only at best imitate life. The reality of combat is not glorious. It is in fact brutal and should be avoided at all costs. The samurai ideal is to preserve peace, uphold justice, and maintain social order, affording to everyone then the right to life, liberty, and property. The recent video that I saw on social media showed a Ukrainian soldier with a helmet cam outside a blue fence and a door leading into a compound with damaged building. The soldier cautiously retreated and called in a quadcopter drone to deliver an explosive device to a suspected enemy-occupied building. After the explosion, the soldier re-engaged at the fence line, entering slowly and cautiously, and then suddenly took fire from a window of that building. He dropped to the ground, returned fire, and approached the building to throw a hand grenade, and was soon engaged suddenly by a Russian soldier who had come outside. A struggle ensued over a knife, with both combatants sustaining multiple defensive wounds. The ultimate survivor of that engagement was a Russian from the Yakut Siberian area, who later recounted the details of that brutal life and death struggle in the combat zone's rubble and debris. And from what I understand now, he was awarded by President Vladimir Putin with a certain distinguishing medal. And it turns out that his name is Andrei Grigoriev. But it just reminds me of just how absurd combat is, how sudden it can be, and that there is no such thing as honor in a dog's death. So the combat footage that emerged depicted a knife fight between a Ukrainian soldier and a Russian of Siberian descent. It's both striking and emotional. It's recommended for anyone of interest in the martial arts to view it in its entirety. The footage offers a profound reflection on the nature of interpersonal combat and edged weapons engagement in particular. There's nothing glorious, it's brutal. But there is honor between the way that these two men spilled each other's blood and wound up showing compassion for one another at the end of it all. That's the only dignity, what they showed to each other by allowing the Ukrainian soldier to die in peace at his request, knowing that he was fatally wounded, highlights the humanity involved at the soldier-to-soldier level. The Siberian Yakut Russian left him to make peace with the sky and his mother, demonstrated humanity by finishing him off with a grenade that he didn't see coming. So this Siberian Russian, Andrei Grigoriev, was later interviewed, and interestingly, he only joined the army to prevent his son from being conscripted. He mentioned that the footage, which made him relatively famous, was not the worst hand-to-hand combat he had experienced. He had faced a similar fight months earlier and was only home on Christmas leave, planning to return to the combat zone in January. Yet the helmet camera footage of the Ukrainian soldier shows brutal combat. The two men engaged in a mortal struggle amid the debris and filth of a war-torn country. The Russian soldier later stated that he was taught to have some humanity, even for enemies, since childhood. And we, as martial artists or anybody who's concerned with security or justice affairs, need to confront the reality and not turn away from something brutal. War is brutality. It's the absence of reason, and it is a great atrocity against humanity. We need to engage in it skillfully, only for necessary purpose, and in other cases, always look for the more peaceful option. Look for ways of maintaining justice and security that do not devolve in such a way that makes people sacrifice their lives for nothing. History and Sun Tzu's principles, especially those espoused in Sun Shi, The Art of War, remind us that war is the ground of survival and extinction. We can never lose sight of the fact that this is always about breaking things and killing people. This reality underscores the purpose of the nation state to protect people and their property from external threats and administer justice among the inhabitants of a territory. Combat footage like that coming out of Ukraine reminds us that martial arts can only emulate combat conditions and never equate them. No matter what martial art one studies, the map is never the territory. Art only imitates life. If combat footage disgusts us, we should be more circumspect about how nation-states engage in war. If we value life, liberty, and property and recognize that the purpose of government in an enlightened society is to protect these, then war should only be engaged in when absolutely necessary. However, modern wars are often carried out for nefarious purposes, benefiting a few at the expense of many, usually those coming from lower classes and those that have less option. And war should be conducted according to legal principles. In the United States, Congress has the power to declare war and issue letters of marque and reprisal. There is no authority for simply authorizing the use of military force or leaving these decisions to the chief executive. Every deviation from these legal principles has allowed the military-industrial complex to expand significantly, especially since World War II. Therefore, war benefits those that don't have skin in the game, that are not exposing themselves to the lethality and brutality of combat. Various tactics within the military-industrial complex lead Congress to acquiesce to foreign misadventure. Public officials have incentives to indulge this complex with funding, allowing think tanks to justify belligerence under terms like foreign internal defense or international security assistance. The result is subsidizing the security of states outside the Union at taxpayers' expense, thereby violating fundamental property rights and legal procedures. No one should have to fund programs and policies that they don't support. Studying the martial arts and participating in key societal institutions is crucial for securing a free state. Indeed, your martial training ultimately contributes to the maintenance of law and order in a free society. And when people neglect this social obligation, scheming political officers, politicians, and bureaucrats can take advantage of that lethargy. The militia of the several states is responsible for executing the law, repelling invasions, and suppressing insurrection. This is the most urgent security need: to arrest the corrupt activities of politicians and bureaucrats operating outside the constitutional order of delegated authority. The absence of the militia of the several states is why there is so much lawlessness and disorder on the scene right now. In January of 2025, two high-profile terrorism attacks occurred, one in New Orleans on Bourbon Street and another at Trump Tower in Las Vegas. These situations should be viewed with suspicion, questioning the media's portrayal and considering potential ulterior motives or ulterior factors involved in what's being seen? Why should federal agencies like the FBI be involved in these investigations when the Constitution delegates jurisdiction only over 3 crimes: piracy, counterfeiting, and treason? The existence and mission of agencies like the FBI, ATF, Secret Service, and Homeland Security should be questioned, as all other crimes are left to the member states or the localities to investigate. And when it comes to piracy, counterfeiting, and treason, well, the Constitution is very clear as to how law gets executed. It is a matter of Congress calling forth the militia of the several states to execute the law. There are lots of different ways of looking at these situations that show there is a potential increase for martial law, using these organs of centralized, quote-unquote, law enforcement or federal law enforcement, or recruiting local law enforcement into federal task forces so that they can then carry out legislation that is not based in constitutionally delegated authority. So therefore, martial law is a threat to the security of a free state. This then leads to the next chapter in Dr. Edwin Vieira's By Tyranny Out of Necessity, The Bastardy of Martial Law, which is what we will continue with our reading now. And so begins The Impossibility of Martial Law under the Declaration of Independence, Part 2 of Dr. Edwin Vieira's 2014 By Tyranny Out of Necessity, The Bastardy of Martial Law. Chapter 5, Martial Law Discountenanced in Pre-Constitutional Anglo-American Legal Tradition. The Declaration of Independence announced in the name and by the authority of the good people of the 13 colonies that the United Colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Thus, the Declaration is the legal foundation for the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the several states, and all of the laws enacted in pursuance thereof, is ultimately superior to them all, and is itself subordinate only to the laws of nature and of nature's God. So, if anything akin to martial governance can possibly be countenanced under American law, it must be justifiable in the face of the Declaration of Independence. That end can be accomplished only if a source for martial governance can be discovered. And for the Declaration, that is, in some specific statement within the Declaration which, by applying, approving of, or acquiescing in martial governance validates it, or extra the Declaration, that is, in some authority which exists outside the Declaration but contradicts nothing therein, and by being applied to the subjects and objects of the Declaration in effect, supplements it, or supra the Declaration, that is, in some authority which for some purposes, under some circumstances, can effectively supersede and perhaps even to some degree negate the Declaration. No such source, however, can possibly be found. The first and most important step towards elucidating the true meaning of America's foundational legal documents is to review the background and environment of the period in which those documents were fashioned and adopted, to place ourselves as nearly as possible in the condition of the Americans of that era, and to recall the contemporary or then recent history of the controversies on the subject that still were fresh in the memories of those who achieved our independence and established our form of government. One must not, however, enter only the individual minds of the framers who drafted the Declaration, the original Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, or of the Founding Fathers who worked for their ratification, or of others amongst the most prominent patriots of their time, but instead must search out the most probable consensus among all of the reasonably intelligent and informed Americans of personal integrity who supported independence and whom the Declaration singles out as the good people of the colonies, whom the original Constitution identifies as we the people, and to whom the Bill of Rights repeatedly refers to as the people. The question then becomes how, on the basis of their own knowledge and experience, would the good people in 1776, we the people in 1788, and the people in 1791 have determined what the Declaration of Independence, the original Constitution, and then the Bill of Rights would have meant to them with respect to modern-day martial governance. To determine that, it suffices to understand what those documents would have meant to Americans in that day with respect to the martial law with which they had become all too familiar, but which, it should be recalled, was far less rigorous than contemporary martial governance. That area of inquiry was of concern not just to every American patriot of the founding era who was conversant with pre-constitutional Anglo-American law, history, and political philosophy either, as even Blackstone himself had observed. The military state includes the whole of the soldiery, or such persons as are peculiarly appointed among the rest of the people for the safeguard and defense of the realm. In a land of liberty, it is extremely dangerous to make a distinct order of the profession of arms. In absolute monarchies, this is necessary for the safety of the prince, and arises from the main principle of their constitution, which is that of governing by fear. But in free states, the profession of a soldier, taken singly and merely as a profession, is justly an object of jealousy. In these, no man should take up arms, but with a view to defend his country and its laws. He puts not off the citizen when he enters the camp, but it is because he is a citizen, and would wish to continue so, that he makes himself for a while a soldier. The laws, therefore, and constitution of these kingdoms, that is, England, Scotland, and Ireland, know no such state as that of a perpetual standing soldier, bred up to no other profession than that of war. To prevent the executive power from being able to oppress, it is requisite that the armies with which it is entrusted should consist of the people, and have the same spirit with the people. Nothing then, according to these principles, ought to be more guarded against in a free state than making the military power, when such a one is necessary to be kept on foot, a body too distinct from the people. And I'll break in simply to say, the clear dividing line has to be those that make their living through taxation versus those that are paying the taxes. That's what makes the key distinction between someone who is a state functionary or bureaucrat and a citizen. The citizen is the one that has to make the sacrifice. Therefore, the citizenry must also be the ones that bear the arms and execute the laws. Moving on. For if the military power were too distinct from the people, it would soon imagine itself independent of, and then superior and even antagonistic to, them, and therefore capable, if not deserving, of exercising unbridled authority over the people, certainly against their wills, and likely against their best interests. Blackstone was no less critical and suspicious of what he called martial law. When the nation, that is England, was engaged in war, more veteran troops and more regular discipline were esteemed to be necessary than could be expected from a mere militia. And therefore, at such times, more rigorous methods were put in use for the raising of armies, and the due regulation and discipline of the soldiery, which are to be looked upon only as temporary excrescences, bred out of the distemper of the state, and not as any part of the permanent and perpetual laws of the kingdom. For martial law, which is built upon no settled principles, but is entirely arbitrary in its decisions, is in truth and reality no law, but something indulged, rather than allowed as a law. The necessity of order and discipline in an army is the only thing which can give it countenance, and therefore it ought not to be permitted in time of peace, when the king's courts are open for all persons to receive justice according to the laws of the land. And it is laid down that if a lieutenant or other that hath commission of martial authority doth in time of peace hang or otherwise execute any man by color of martial law, that is murder, for it is against Magna Carta, and the petition of rights enacts that no commission shall issue to proceed within this land according to martial law. Thus, to Blackstone and those who learned from and relied upon his exegesis of pre-constitutional English law, martial law was, in comparison with true law in a free society, a veritable contradiction in terms. For martial law set the traditional social order upside down. As Blackstone observed, law is properly defined to be a rule of civil conduct prescribed by the supreme power in a state, commanding what is right and prohibiting what is wrong. But during pre-constitutional times, standing armies were never acknowledged as legitimately wielding the supreme power in the state, either in Great Britain or in America. Rather, Blackstone taught that by the sovereign power is meant the making of laws for wherever that power resides, all others must conform to and be directed by it. And specifically in America, from 1776 onwards, we the people assumed the mantle of sovereign power, as evidenced by their having lent their name and their authority to the dissolution of all political connection between the colonies and the state of Great Britain, and then having ordained and established the Constitution. So inasmuch as we the people recognize themselves as constituting the supreme human source of law in this country, they necessarily excluded themselves as the mere subjects of some supposedly superior power sounding in martial law. Moreover, as Blackstone pointedly explained, martial law is extremely dangerous in a land of liberty, because it is built upon no settled principles, but is entirely arbitrary in its decisions, the better to enable unscrupulous rulers to govern by fear. So, inasmuch as the patriotic political movement in the late 1700s was directed towards securing America as a land of liberty, no one ever to be governed by fear, martial law was entirely out of place. Chapter 6. Martial law explicitly denounced by the Declaration of Independence. Those who framed America's foundational legal documents had for a long time been absorbed in considering the arbitrary encroachments of the British Crown on the liberty of the subject. If many and complex were the reasons for which patriotic Americans in pre-constitutional times developed very palpable political, legal, and even personal antipathies to standing armies and to the martial law which soldiers enforced against civilians, that they did so was patent to everyone. Time and again, patriots denounced standing armies and martial law in terms even stronger than Blackstone had set to paper, and not simply as matters merely of principle, but as the direct results of the actual practices of standing armies and enforcement of martial law in the colony. The Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress of 14 October 1774 echoed Blackstone's aversion to martial law in its complaint that the British Parliament hath extended the jurisdiction of the courts of admiralty for the trial of causes merely arising within the body of a county, and in its resolution that the keeping a standing army in these colonies in times of peace without the consent of the legislature of that colony in which such army is kept is against law. Going further, in its declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms, 6 July 1775, the Continental Congress excoriated the legislature of the Great Britain, which, stimulated by an inordinate passion for a power not only unjustifiable, but which they know to be peculiarly reprobated by the very constitution of that kingdom, and desperate of success in any mode of contest, where regard should be had to truth, law, or right, have at length, deserting those, attempted to effect their cruel and impolitic purpose of enslaving these colonies by violence, and have thereby rendered it necessary for us to close with their last appeal from reason to arm. In particular, the Continental Congress described in detail how British General Thomas Gage, who in the course of the last year had taken possession of the town of Boston in the province of Massachusetts Bay, and still occupied it as a garrison on the 19th day of April 1775, sent out from that place a large detachment of his army, who made an unprovoked assault on the inhabitants at the town of Lexington, murdered 8 of its inhabitants, and wounded many others. From thence the troops proceeded in warlike array to the town of Concord, where they set upon another party of the inhabitants, killing several and wounding more, until compelled to retreat by the country people suddenly assembled to repel this cruel aggression. Hostilities thus commenced by the British troops have been since prosecuted by them without regard to faith or reputation, the inhabitants of Boston being confined within that town by the general their governor, and having, in order to procure their dismission, entered into a treaty with him, it was stipulated that the said inhabitants, having deposited their arms with their own magistrates, should have liberty to depart, taking with them their other effect. They accordingly delivered up their arms, but in open defiance of honor, in defiance of the obligation of treaties which even savage nations esteemed sacred, the governor ordered the arms to be seized by a body of soldiers, detained the greatest part of the inhabitants in the town, and compelled the few who were permitted to retire to leave their most valuable effects behind. The general, by proclamation, after venting the grossest falsehoods and calumnies against the good people of these colonies, proceeds to declare them all, either by name or description, to be rebels and traitors, to supersede the course of the common law, and instead thereof to publish and order the use and exercise of the law martial. General Gage's imposition of the law martial left the patriots but one alternative. We are reduced to choosing an unconditional submission to tyranny of irritated ministers or resistance by force. The latter is our choice. We have counted the cost of this contest and find nothing so dreadful as voluntary slavery. Honor, justice, and humanity forbid us tamely to surrender that freedom which we received from our gallant ancestors, and which our innocent posterity have a right to receive from us. We cannot endure the infamy and guilt of resigning succeeding generations to that wretchedness which inevitably awaits them if we basely entail hereditary bondage upon them. Thereafter, abhorrence of military rule became ingrained in our form of government. The Declaration of Independence went beyond the Continental Congress's invocation of resistance by force to the assertion that the United Colonies are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. Thereafter, the abhorrence of military rule became ingrained in our form of government. The Declaration of Independence went beyond the Continental Congress's invocation of resistance by force to the assertion that the United Colonies are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. In explaining and justifying this course of action, far from applying, approving of, or acquiescing in anything akin to modern martial governance, or advancing any reason which might validate even the less stringent form of martial law known in its own day, the Declaration explicitly attacked the history of the present King of Great Britain as a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial, from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. In this litany of the most egregious aspects of martial law, arguably the worst is the affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power, for if that can be done, then all the rest and even more will inevitably follow, inasmuch as no one will have any legal recourse independent of the executors of martial law themselves against whatever enormities they may choose to commit. Now, obviously, no one can draw even the most tenuously implicit acquiescence in, let alone approval of, martial law from this catalogue of grievances which marked King George III as a tyrant, unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Neither can anyone possibly claim that martial law is superior or even equal in any sense to the Declaration of Independence, or in any manner capable of exerting a controlling influence upon it. For the Declaration denounces the imposition of martial law by the British in no uncertain terms as one of the reasons for its assertion of the 13 colonies' moral, political, and legal right to be free and independent states, and to have full power to do all acts and things which independent states may of right do. Rather, from this denunciation, everyone must conclude that, even in the relatively mild form in which it existed in the 18th century, martial law could not be found among the laws of nature and of nature's God, which entitled Americans in 1776, and still entitle them today, to assume among the powers of the earth their separate and equal station, so neither it can be found among the laws of any political regime which the laws of nature and of nature's God might sanction at the present time. Martial law is nothing more than an ersatz form of government which is instituted among men without the consent of the governed for the specific purposes of obviating the need to obtain particular consent to martial law in the first place, and precluding the withholding or withdrawal of any general manifestation of consent to or from a political regime, which could be so twisted as to rationalize the imposition of martial law at any time. Because it does not derive from, but instead negates the consent of the governed, martial law cannot be the product of the exercise of a just power by any form of government, but must arise out of an unjust power. For any power which does not derive from the consent of the governed is unjust by hypothesis. For the most pertinent example, the preamble to the Constitution attests that one reason we the people ordained and established the Constitution was in order to establish justice. Should someone other than the people purport to ordain and establish some supposed law applicable to them, that action would not establish justice, but instead would promote the very opposite outcome. As the spawn of a manifestly unjust power generated not by the consent of the governed, but by tyranny out of necessity, martial law is designed and inevitably applied not to secure all men's certain unalienable rights, but instead to abridge any and all of those rights as may be convenient in order to further the illicit purposes of the rogue officials who invoke such law. Inasmuch as the purpose of martial law is to enable rogue officials, in Blackstone's perceptive phrase, to govern by fear, martial law is always destructive of the ends for which every proper form of government should be instituted. Indeed, martial law is inevitably the culmination of a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, which evinces a design to reduce the people under absolute despotism. And, for that reason, upon the appearance of martial law, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish the form of government which invokes such ersatz law, and to institute new government. Indeed, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government entirely, even by force of arms if necessary, and to provide new guards for their future security against martial law. At the point at which the attempted imposition of martial law proves that rogue public officials have effectively abdicated government by declaring the people out of their protection and waging war against them, the good people no longer owe any obedience to those officials or any allegiance to the form of government those officials have perverted. For even as Blackstone observed, allegiance is usually, and therefore most easily, considered as the duty of the people and protection as the duty of the magistrate, and yet they are, reciprocally, the rights as well as duties of each other. Allegiance is the right of the magistrate, and protection the right of the people. And in American law, the very idea of a political community, such as a nation is, implies an association of persons for the promotion of their general welfare. Each one of the persons associated becomes a member of the nation formed by the association. He owes it allegiance and is entitled to its protection. Allegiance and protection are, in this connection, reciprocal obligations. The one is a compensation for the other. Allegiance for protection and protection for allegiance. The government's obligation of protection is correlative with the duty of loyal support inherent in the citizen's allegiance. Therefore, the attempted imposition of martial law by the British in America in the 1770s justified not only American patriots' forcible opposition to martial law itself, but also renunciation by the good people of the colonies of all allegiances and obediences, whether sounding in morality, politics, or law, to the regime which it invoked it. For the advent of martial law conclusively established the illegitimacy of British rule over the colonies and the legitimacy of their struggle for independence from it. So, mutatis mutandis, would the situation be today were analogous circumstances to arise. According to the Declaration of Independence, even as a free and independent state herself, Britain could not lawfully have imposed martial law upon the colonists, notwithstanding their status as subjects of the king, or as one component of a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object which had evinced a design to reduce Americans under absolute despotism. Martial law violated the laws of nature and of nature's God. For that reason, it could not have been the product of any just power wielded by the king and parliament, or by any other form of government for that matter, but instead derived from their acts of pretended legislation. Because any power under the aegis of which martial law arose was not a just power, no form of government could have claimed to have derived such a power from the consent of the governed, and no people could have given such consent. Certainly, the good people of America did not claim, and could never have claimed, such a power for themselves and for their newly free and independent states. Indeed, such a claim would have evidenced something far worse than mere hypocrisy, for it would have exposed as a blatant falsehood the Declaration's denunciation of martial law as a grievance which justified Americans in throwing off the British government and providing new guards for their future security. So, when the good people asserted that their free and independent states have full power to do all acts and things which independent states may of right do, they could not have believed that this full power included any license for their own state to impose martial law upon them. Neither could they have believed that any subsequent federal government which we the people of those states created under the aegis of the Declaration could be empowered to fasten martial law upon the people. Were rogue public officials in the states or the general government to attempt to invoke martial law, or worse yet, martial governance, against we the people today, they would find themselves in a position even less tenable than did King George III. The crisis to which the Declaration of Independence responded came about because not only the king but also the legislature of Great Britain was stimulated by an inordinate passion for a power not only unjustifiable, but which they knew to be peculiarly reprobated by the very constitution of that kingdom. That is, because Americans were then subjects of the king, to both of whom the very constitution of the kingdom applied. The struggle between the colonies and the mother country began as a domestic dispute over what the standing constitutional law of that time allowed. The very constitution of that kingdom, however, was largely unwritten, a protean conception which was a pastiche of political and legal precedents, some arising out of usurpation, rather than of fixed principles, or what would be denoted a very flexibly living constitution in the terminology of the present day. No doubt then, had the king and parliament successfully rammed martial law down the colonists' throats, their tyrannous triumph would have constituted a powerful precedent in favor of martial law in the British Constitution thereafter, and perhaps they might even honestly have believed that they were justified by some arcana in that Constitution in their attempt to establish such a precedent. So, that the Declaration of Independence excoriated martial law as plainly violative of such an unwritten living constitution proves that no honest public official, or any informed citizen for that matter, could possibly consider even the relatively mild variety of British martial law known in the Founders' era to be consistent with a written constitution, the legality and efficacy of which depend entirely upon the Declaration, from which all public officials ultimately derive not only their powers, but also their disability. As these conclusions must be drawn from the Declaration of Independence's denunciation of the relatively dilute form of martial law known in its day, when the British could employ only primitive and inefficient means to aid in the enforcement of such law, how much more irreconcilable with the Declaration and everything that has followed from under its aegis must be the highly concentrated, industrial strength martial governance of modern times, which can employ the most technologically up-to-date tools of tyranny, in addition to the tried and true methods of deceit and brutality that one paramilitary police state apparatus after another has honed to a fine edge over the last 2 centuries. Not surprisingly, the constitutions of several of the newly free and independent states denounced with like displeasure 2 of the grievances sounding in martial law which the Declaration of Independence had levied against the king, namely that he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, and that he has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. For example, Delaware, Article 1, Section 17, no standing army shall be kept up without the consent of the legislature, and the military shall, in all cases and at all times, be in strict subordination to the civil power. Maryland, that a well-regulated militia is the proper and natural defense of a free government, and then later in chapter 26 that standing armies are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be raised or kept up without consent of the legislature. Chapter 27, that in all cases and at all times the military ought to be under strict subordination to and control of the civil power. Massachusetts, Article 17 of its Constitution. The people have a right to keep and bear arms for the common defense, and as in time of peace, armies are dangerous to liberty. They ought not to be maintained without the consent of the legislature, and the military power shall always be held in an exact subordination to the civil authority and be governed by it. New Hampshire, Article 24. A well-regulated militia is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a state. Article 25. Standing armies are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be raised or kept up without the consent of the legislature. Article 26. In all cases and at all times, the military ought to be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. North Carolina, Article 17. That the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of the state, and as standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up, and that the military should be kept under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. Pennsylvania, Article 13. That the people have a right to keep and bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state, and as standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not be kept up, and that the military should be kept under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. South Carolina, that the military be subordinate to the civil power of the state. Virginia, Section 13. That a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That standing armies in time of peace should be avoided, as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. Other states made like declarations upon their ratifications of the Constitution of the United States, including New York, that the people have a right to keep and bear arms, that a well-regulated militia, including the body of the people, capable of bearing arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be kept up, except in cases of necessity, and that at all times the military should be under strict subordination to the civil power. New York submitted her ratification under these impressions, and declaring that the rights aforesaid cannot be abridged or violated, and that the explanations aforesaid are consistent with the Constitution of the United States. Rhode Island, Article 17, that the people have a right to keep and bear arms, that a well-regulated militia, including the body of the people capable of bearing arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be kept up except in cases of necessity, and at all times the military should be under strict subordination to the civil power. As did New York in her ratification, Rhode Island added that she was asserting the right of the people to keep and bear arms, the cruciality of a militia to the defense of a free state, and the necessity for limitations on standing armies under these impressions, and declaring that the rights aforesaid cannot be abridged or violated, and that the explanations aforesaid are consistent with the United States Constitution. Self-evidently, the wisdom of these statements is relevant not only to the era in which they were penned, because standing armies have proven themselves dangerous to liberty throughout history and society after society, Any variety of martial law imposed directly by standing armies on the general populace must likely prove fatal to liberty, today as well as in the 1700s. Therefore, a military, which should in all cases and at all times be kept under strict and exact subordination to the civil power, and which should always be governed by the civil power, cannot be suffered to impose any form of martial law on civilians in any era for any reason, precisely because the invariable excuse for recourse to martial law is that the civil power is incapable of dealing with the situation, and therefore the military must itself take control without being subordinated to or governed by that supposedly incompetent civil power. Or perhaps even greater consequence, moreover, is the contrast these documents drew between, on the one hand, a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms as the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state, and on the other hand, standing armies, which in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty. The form of martial law, if it can be called that, which the militia could and should enforce at appropriate times under their authority and responsibility to execute the laws of the Union and suppress insurrections, could hardly ever become dangerous to liberty, for a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, not antagonistic to it. The militia could hardly be anything other than subordinated to and governed by the civil power, for the militia are composed of the body of the people themselves, who also constitute the true sovereigns, and therefore the ultimate civil power of this country, and properly organized, equipped, and trained according to constitutional standards, the militia could hardly prove inferior to the military in maintaining order in the face of crises in domestic venues. For the Constitution itself presumes their superiority by incorporating them as permanent parts of the federal system and explicitly assigning to them alone the task of executing the laws of the Union and suppressing insurrections, while treating with great suspicion the armies which it empowers Congress to raise and support, but from which it enables each new House of Representatives to withhold an appropriation of money to that use. Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. If you like what you've heard here, please give us a like, thumbs up, or a positive review on iTunes or the podcatcher of your choice. If you would like more content like this, please check out my books on shop.everydaysamurai.life. Let's stay in touch, keep the faith, and move forward with confidence, knowing that we will prevail or die with dignity, no matter what it looks like on the outside, because that is what samurai do. They cultivate their inner strength and energy so that they are impervious to the appearances of the world. That is why we train. That is the offering that we provide in service to liberty. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.